Well, hello, everyone. Good to see you. How's everyone this afternoon? Chloe, it looks like you're talking, but I can't hear you. But you sound
Oh,
very...
I was just talking to myself, but
Oh, that's
I'm
okay.
doing
Okay.
well.
Good,
It's a little
good.
gloomy, but it's okay.
Okay. Gloomy, just the weather or life?
Yeah, it's been raining all day.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So anyone else have anything they wanted to share? Okay. I thought what I would do today is talk more about science. I actually have some slides I can share with you. Let me see if this works. Okay, so in 1743, Franklin visits Boston. About every 10 years, he comes home for a visit, and with his family, with his parents who are still living, and with he has a brother and a sister who continue living in Boston, a couple of brothers and a sister. In fact, his sister, who survives him, over the course of his life, he and she will exchange more letters than he does with anyone else. Jane Meekum, who lives most of her life in a modest house behind Old North Church. In fact, Franklin owns it at the end of her life, and she maintains the family shop. Anyway, Franklin would visit about every 10 years. And on his visit in 1743, he met a Scottish doctor named Dr. Archibald Spencer. And Dr. Spencer, who is slightly older than Franklin, was traveling around the country giving what he called philosophical lectures. And I should say at this time, it was illegal in Boston to have any kind of theatrical performance, any kind of entertainment like this. So you will find in the 1700s a lot of what are called philosophical lectures or lectures that actually are thinly disguised theatrical performances. But I don't think that Dr. Spencer really was doing a theatrical performance. You can see actually the notice here of how much he charges for his philosophical lectures. The high point of it was his lecture that Franklin saw was on how to use the electrical fluid to cure diseases of the eye. And Spencer is one of these 18th century people really entranced with these ideas of fluids that we were talking about last time. And with also Isaac Newton's work on light and heat and the transference of light and heat. And Spencer's, the high point of his lecture, that again, he's using light and heat to treat diseases of the eye. And he would demonstrate it in this way. A small boy would be suspended from the ceiling horizontally. And then someone, Dr. Spencer, would rub a glass tube with a piece of wool. And then holding the glass tube against the boy's feet would make sparks shoot out of the boy's eyes. Now, I don't know that this cured any diseases of the eye this boy might have been having, but you can imagine this is quite a remarkable display. The dean has told me we can't do this in class. It would be a phenomenal thing to demonstrate. And here you can see a different demonstration of it where the boy is suspended from the ceiling and then he's touching the hand of this young girl. And then from her hand, sparks are flowing into this basin. This is a remarkable thing and it captivates Franklin. In London, a fellow named Gray had done similar tricks. And the good thing for Gray was he happened to live next door to the Foundling Hospital, which was an orphan asylum, well, an asylum for children of unwed mothers in London. There was a big problem in London in the middle of the 1700s of children being born out of wedlock. And you'll recall the story of Mrs. T in the autobiography. And the Foundling Hospital in London was one of the big charities of the period. And so Gray lives next door to the Foundling Hospital, where he typically could find young boys who would be willing for a few extra shillings to be suspended from the ceiling and have sparks shot out of their eyes. It doesn't really seem to hurt anyone. I don't know, as I said, if it cures anyone's diseases of the eye. But Dr. Spencer seems to be onto something with this, and it really gets Franklin's attention. At this time, other people are also paying attention to the electrical fluid. In Germany, this is another demonstration of this. A fellow in Leiden, in Holland, a guy named Muschenberg, had created this glass jar which actually can contain the electrical fluid. You know, it's one thing to do the rubbing of the glass tube, and here you can see there's an apparatus actually designed so you can turn a crank and make the tube keep rubbing, and this generates friction, and that is, you can then store this electrical fluid in this Leyden jar. This German doctor named Bose, G.M. Bose, creates something equally dramatic, the electrical kiss. And here you can see what happens. One person is standing on a platform that's made of resin, and then that person then has the electrical charge, and another person kisses that person. Of course, there's a great electrical charge, which sometimes there is when you kiss another person, and sometimes there isn't. This is a way of guaranteeing there always will be that electrical charge. And a guy in Leipzig makes a classification actually of different kinds of sparks and different kinds of glows. That is also experimenting, rubbing a glass tube with a piece of steel wool, and you get, or I'm sorry, a piece of real wool, and you get a different kind of a spark or a different kind of a glow. And there was also another German named Winkler who drew an analogy between these electrical sparks you can see being created with an apparatus like this and lightning, the big electrical sparks you might see in the sky. Of course, at this time, no one was quite certain what lightning was, or if these two things were related, this electrical fluid and this natural force that we know can be quite destructive. In the Amsterdam Journal, yet another of these new magazines of the period, that's a compilation of all kinds of interesting ideas. The Amsterdam Journal in 1744 had an article reviewing all of this work on the electrical fluid. And then it was translated into English for the Gentleman's Magazine in 1745. So at about the same time, Franklin goes to Boston, sees Dr. Spencer suspending a boy from the ceiling in this theater in Boston, or public hall in Boston, and sees sparks shoot out of the boy's eyes. There are people in Germany and in Poland and in France and in Holland doing similar kinds of experiments with this new force. And Franklin at this time is the postmaster in Philadelphia. And so as the postmaster, he gets one of the first copies of the Gentleman's Magazine, which has a survey of all of this scientific work. It's a translation of this Dutch article, which surveys what is being done with this electrical fluid all over Europe. And at about the same time, he's involved in creating the Library Company of Philadelphia, and they had been in correspondence with a guy in London named Peter Collinson. And Collinson was sending the Library Company various books and other things that he thought would be of interest. And one of the things that Collinson sends to Franklin, because he's part of the Library Company, is a glass tube. And of course, the glass tube is what Dr. Spencer had been using initially. And Spencer had other kinds of apparatus he was using, and he has kind of a traveling show. He goes to Philadelphia, probably at Franklin's invitation, and gives a series of lectures there. But Franklin winds up buying all of Spencer's equipment from him because he is so excited about these this stuff that can be done with this electrical fluid. And in fact, at this time, actually, it's not too much to say that this chance encounter with Dr. Spencer in Boston and the reception of a glass tube and an issue of the Gentleman's Magazine transform Franklin's life. They change his life, and they also help to change the world. It's not too much of an exaggeration to say that these things that all happen seemingly at random in the middle of the 1740s are going to have a profound impact on Franklin's life as well as our lives. So Franklin at this time also is in the process of, well, this speeds up his decision to get out of the printing business. He turns the printing business over to an associate, a guy named David Hall. And the agreement is Hall will run the business and Franklin will share the profits. It's actually a beneficial arrangement for both of them. Franklin at this time, remember, this is about 15 years or so after he had started the printing shop in Philadelphia. And over that time, he had trained a lot of apprentices. As an apprentice, you would work for your master for about 7 years, and then you could set up in business. Now, Franklin was very shrewd. He didn't want all of his apprentices to set up shop in Philadelphia. Some of them might in the general area. But if you were one of Franklin's apprentices and you would instead, when your term as an apprentice was up, go to, say, Baltimore or Charleston, South Carolina, or Williamsburg, Virginia, or one of the West Indies, he then would help you set up in business there. That is, he would help pay for your printing press and your type. There are a couple of stipulations. You are going to be paying him back over the course of your career as a printer. And also, you all are going to be using the same kind of type, Caslin type. And this means that if one printer gets a job that is too big for him, he actually can share it with other printers. So Franklin is doing a couple of things here with printing. He's setting up really a very lucrative business model and helping to spread the professional printing throughout British North America. And the fees he gets from the printers, he has helped to set up, as well as the stipend he gets being the deputy postmaster, actually give him an annual income at the time of about £2,000, which was more than the governor of Pennsylvania made. Today, this would be the equivalent of about £400,000, which is enough to live, $400,000, I'm sorry, which is enough to live comfortably, as you probably should be aware, and also enough for him to attend to his various experiments. Unlike his parents, Franklin and his wife only have, at this time, 2 children. William, who was born in 1730 and now is in his 20s, and Sally, who is now, she's getting into her teens at about the same time that her father is becoming more distracted with electricity, which becomes his real passion. In fact, he's pretty much turned over his business to Hall, and he now is really dedicating himself from the fall months through the late spring to experiments with electricity. Now, early in 1746, this fellow in Leyden, Peter van Musschenbroek, created this special jar. Here's a picture of some of these jars to hold this fluid. And it's a glass jar that has a foil coating around it, and then a cork with a cork stopper, and there's a metal chain descending into it. I think I have another picture of this somewhere here of what this jar looks like, something like this. And you can use this jar to store the electrical fluid, as I think I've already said. So Franklin, by the way, gives this the name when he receives one. It's a Leyden jar, and it is actually still called a Leyden jar. Franklin, by the way, also coins a lot of other terms we still use for various electrical functions. For example, he calls, does anyone know what he calls the guys who experiment with electricity? What would you call them? Chloe, you're still talking to yourself?
Yeah, I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know. Electric voice. I don't know.
Electric boys. Well, that's a good one. What do you call someone today who works with electricity?
Electrician.
An electrician. That's right. And that's a word Franklin coined. And he noticed that when you fill up the Leyden jar with the electrical fluid, and then the electrical fluid goes out, what do you call it when you fill something with electricity? Say a phone.
To charge it?
You charge it, yeah. So that's a word Franklin coins for putting an electrical charge into something. Taking the charge out is discharging it. He also noticed that sometimes an electrical charge attracts another charge, sometimes it repels it. So this is a phenomenon in an electrical charge. Do you know what you call those things? One charge versus the other? One attracts another, the other repels.
Like positive and negative charge.
Positive and negative, exactly, yes. And also you saw in that image, there was a Leyden jar. So you have one Leyden jar. You can actually put a number of them together, and this will make a bigger charge. And also you can store more of the electrical fluid. And what do you call a place where you can store electricity?
Battery?
A battery, yeah. Again, it comes from a term for a place where you would store ammunition. So yeah, battery. These are all terms Franklin coins as he's working with electricity. He and a group of guys in Philadelphia, they form like a little club where they'll get together and they'll do a lot of this work at home. And they have a big advantage over the European scientists or natural philosophers who are doing this. The natural philosophers in Europe tended to be college professors. So people who have a lot of time, which they can devote to this. I don't want to tell you that college professors do have a lot of time on their hands, but actually, to be honest, we do. But yeah, so Franklin and his cohort aren't college professors, but they are able to do something a lot of college professors can't, which is to make stuff. That is, Franklin was a printer. He was used to working with his hands in that way. Another guy in their circle, Philip Singh, is a silversmith, which means he is able to work with metal and actually is able to fix these spherical jars. That is, they're trying to store the electrical current in this spherical jar, and realizes if you put the jar on an axis or an iron axle, you can use a small handle to turn it. The same principle as a grinding stone, where you have the grinding stone doing the work of sharpening a knife instead of you pushing the knife across it. And this is a real labor-saving device. So because these guys are skilled craftsmen, able to work with their hands, they're able to do a lot of the creating of things. A college professor in Germany wants to do something like this. He has to go find someone capable of doing it, pay them to do the work, and so on. And of course, it's never done to the satisfaction of a college professor. So Franklin and his friends have this advantage over these various men of natural philosophers in Europe, and that they're able to do a lot of this work themselves. And they all become fascinated with this, and they all find out different things about it. Thomas Hopkinson is another guy in Franklin's circle, and he notices that if you have an iron rod with pointy ends, those pointy ends also throw off the electrical fire. And another guy in the circle, a guy named Ebenezer Kinnersley, and his day job was as a Baptist minister. And he discovers that this Leyden jar is as much charged or electrified through the foil coating on the outside as it is through the wire going into it. It's a big mystery. What is it inside the Leyden jar that actually holds the electricity? Is it the fluid inside? Is it the chain inside? Sometimes they would put marbles inside. Are they electrified? What is it that's electrified? And Kinnersley realizes it's actually the outside of the jar, which means you don't need to put water in it at all. That was the big thing that these guys do, they spend the winter actually of 1746, 1747 experimenting with all of this. And Franklin writes to Peter Collinson, the fellow who had sent them the electrical apparatus, and he writes up everything they had done in such a clear way that anyone can follow this, and anyone also could replicate it. And Franklin is writing, remember, he's from Philadelphia, which is not the center of the world. It's really on the periphery of the British Empire. But here, he and his circle are conducting various experiments, and for all they know, people in Europe are probably doing the same thing. He thinks that they're probably making similar observations. So what he's doing is he and his friends are conducting these experiments, and he's making observations of them and then writing them down so that other people can say, yeah, we had a similar thing happen. In this way, a much wider circle of people is coming to understand how this force works and what exactly the force is. For my own part, Franklin said, I never was before engaged in any study that so totally engrossed my attention and time as this has lately done. For what with making experiments when I can be alone and repeating them to my friends and acquaintances who from the novelty of the thing come continually in crowds to see them, I have during some months past had little leisure for anything else. So he gave up his business to dedicate himself to this hobby, and then he finds this hobby is taking up most of his time. And plus people are coming to see these things. I mean, seeing him making sparks and so on. As I said, he's retired from printing, so he does have this leisure time to dedicate himself to these experiments. And they find at the end of the year, as the summer approaches in 1747, they are taking the summer off, both because they have to do the experiments indoors because you really can't do this outside. And it's really too hot to be inside in Philadelphia in the summer working on all of these apparatuses. And so, and it also gets hot and humid in Philadelphia in the summer, and electricity doesn't conduct as well under these conditions. So things they're just really coming to discover. But in July of 1747, he sends to Peter Collinson a recap of what they had done this year. And he describes their various experiments with what they still call a miraculous bottle, or what Franklin calls a Leyden jar, and also the lessons he drew from the experiments. For example, they realized that the top of the bottle was charged more than the bottom. And this Franklin deduces to be a positive charge in the top, a negative charge in the bottom. And that equilibrium, which is the state they thought everything sought, was not established inside the bottle, but only outwardly. And if something not charged comes into contact with the bottle, there's a quick and violent shock. Plus and minus, Franklin wrote, are wonderfully balanced in this bottle. And in ways Franklin really didn't understand. What he did understand is that if he touched the bottle, a shock would go through his entire body. And if you touched the wire with one hand while you held the bottle with the other, you're going to get a shock. Let me just see if we can see this bottle again to give you a sense of what it looks like. So you can see the bottle, and there's a wire extend. This is actually after Franklin took the bottle apart to show its components. So you see the foil that goes around the bottle, then the glass jar, and then the top that has a wire coming out of it. And if you touch both the bottom of the jar, the metal part, and then the wire, the shock is going to go through you. The shock, he notes, goes from the wire to the finger, passes through your body to the other hand, and then into the bottom of the bottle. So that seems to explain something which today we would understand as an electrical current, but which at the time, no one did quite understand what this was. And Franklin noted that the more work he did, the more observations he made on this, the more he couldn't explain. He said he was now a little diffident in his hypotheses and was ashamed that he had expressed himself positively earlier. In going on with these experiments, he said, how many pretty systems we build, which we soon find ourselves obliged to destroy. If there's no other use discovered in electricity, he said, this, however, is something considerable, that it might make a vain man humble. So this is something that Franklin and those working on it find extraordinarily mysterious and hard to explain, but there's something that propels them to keep experimenting with it. And the next year, 1748 and 1749, is just as productive. Now they've had 2 years of experimenting with different kinds of different uses of this electrical force. And now they make some real breakthroughs in understanding it. For example, where in this bottle is the charge? Is it in the wire at the top, or is it in the foil at the bottom, or is it in the water inside the bottle? So they charge the bottle, they very carefully remove the water or the wire, and then they decant the water into another bottle. That bottle that gets this electrified water doesn't get charged, but the empty bottle still gives a shock. So this is really a lesson about where the electricity is. It's not in that fluid inside the bottle. Instead, it's in the outside of the bottle. And this is also where Franklin coins the term charging for what's happening to the bottle as the electrical charge is put in place. And they also realize that if you can combine different of these bottles together, you can form a battery that has a greater charge. So again, summer is approaching. They've had these marvelous breakthroughs in understanding how all of this works. And they close off their winter of experiments with a picnic on the banks of the Schuylkill River. They said, according to Franklin, they had been able to discover nothing in this way of use to mankind, but they were able to do some things that were really kind of amusing. One was they realized that guys on one side of the river could create an electrical charge, which they then could send through the river. And on the other side, there was a wire running from the water to a tub of alcohol. And so an electrical shock on one side of the river could go through the river and ignite a tub of spirits on the other side. Again, that would be something, that, I don't know, that's probably as interesting to see as sparks shooting out of a boy's eyes who's always suspended from the ceiling. And they also could use an electrical shock to kill and roast a turkey. Again, showing that this electrical force, you know that if it goes through you, it is going to hurt. If it goes through a turkey, it's not only going to kill the turkey, but also cook the meat of the turkey. And they have guns to being discharged from their electrical battery that is using this electrical force to discharge cannon. And they drink out of these electrified bumpers of alcohol, these flaming spirits, and they drink a toast to all the famous electricians of England, France, and Germany, people they see themselves as united with in conducting these experiments with this remarkable electrical fluid. And Franklin at this time does see a connection, as others had seen, between electricity or the electrical fluid and lightning. Both the electrical fluid and lightning give off light, and that light has a certain color, and both travel in a crooked direction, and both travel very quickly, and both are conducted by metals. And Franklin marked that there was a crack or a noise, an exploding of the electrical fluid, and that a bolt of lightning could tear through anything they passed through. They could kill animals, could melt metals, could set fire to all kinds of things, and also would smell like sulfur, something they had noticed with the electrical fluid in their laboratory. And also noted that people struck by lightning often were blinded. And doing experiments with smaller electrical charges and small poultry, a pigeon or a chicken, I noticed, the turkey, they had a big charge to kill and roast a turkey. A smaller charge on a pigeon or a pullet would also blind the pigeon or the pullet. So again, we started off with Dr. Spencer thinking we'll show how to cure diseases of the eye. Now it seems electricity may have a role in actually striking someone blind. I should say, a lot of this speculation about the connection between lightning and electricity was created because Franklin really was determined to find a positive application for this. So far, what they are able to do is still on the order of a parlor trick or a way of amusing people. Having a tub of alcohol on one side of the river set on fire by an electrical charge sent from the other. And he's really hoping to find some positive application for this. Now, there are two things. Here is a letter he wrote to his brother John in Boston. Actually, he wrote it on Christmas Day of 1750, and I will share it with you because it tells a story that'll probably be of benefit to you. I've lately made an experiment in electricity that I desire never to repeat. Not the word never is repeated twice. 2 nights ago, being about to kill a turkey by the shock from 2 large glass jars containing as much electrical fire as 40 common vials. So he's put an electrical charge into these 2 big Leyden jars, and this would be as much as you would have in 40 of the smaller ones. I inadvertently took the hole through my own arms and body. By receiving the fire from the united top wires with one hand, while the other held a chain connected with the outsides of both jars. The company present, who's talking to me and to one another, I suppose occasioned my inattention to what I was about, say that the flash was very great and the crack as loud as a pistol. Yet my senses of being instantly gone, I neither saw the one nor heard the other, nor did I feel the stroke on my hand, though I afterwards found it raised a round swelling where the fire entered, as big as half a pistol bullet, by which you may judge of the quickness of the electrical fire, which seems to be greater than that of sound, light, and animal sensation. What I can remember of the matter is, I was about to try whether the bottles or jars were fully charged by the strength and length of the stream issuing to my hand, as I commonly used to do. That is the bottle charged? And he would put one hand up to it and get some of the electrical charge into his hand, which I might safely enough have done if I had not held the chain in the other hand. So he's touching the wire at the top of the bottle while he's also still holding the chain connected to the bottom of the bottle. And as he's distracted by all of the people talking and he is talking, and he loses his concentration that you don't touch the wire at the top on the chain at the bottom at the same time. I then felt what I know not how well to describe. A universal blow through my whole body from head to foot, which seemed within as well as without. After which, the first thing I took notice of was a violent, quick shaking of my body, which gradually remitting, my senses gradually returned. And then I thought the bottles must be discharged, but could not conceive and recollected what I had been about to do. out till at last I perceived the chain in my hand and fingers and recollected what I had been about to do. So he's knocked out and doesn't know how this happened. He has the sensation just of something passing through his body and it knocks him to the ground. And then the chain is still in his hand when he comes to. That part of my hand and fingers which held the chain was left white as though the blood had been driven out, and remained so 8 or 10 minutes after, feeling like dead flesh. I had a numbness in my arms and the back of my neck, which continued till the next morning, but wore off. Nothing remains now of this shock, but a soreness in my breastbone, which feels as if I had been bruised. I did not fall, but I suppose I should have been knocked down if I had received the stroke in my head. The whole was over in less than a minute. You may communicate this to Mr. Bowden as a caution to him, but do not make it more public, for I am ashamed to have been guilty of so notorious a blunder. So share this discreetly. He doesn't want people to know what an idiot he had been to electrocute himself when he's just trying to electrocute a turkey in here on the eve of Christmas. And then he tells a couple of jokes about people who do things accidentally. An Irishman who, to divert his wife, poured a bottle of gunpowder on a live coal, or of another who was about to steal powder and so made a hole in the cask with a hot iron. That is, doing stupid things as a way of getting away with something. And Franklin recognizes that holding the wire while you're also holding the chain is really a bad idea. So, cautionary tale for you if you are working with electricity, to be very careful and don't be distracted by others. But then notice how he describes exactly what he felt, and the numbness in his arms and in his neck, and how big the welt was on his hand raised by this. Now, Franklin noted, and the other guys in his circle noted, that the electrical fluid was attracted to metal points. And so he wondered if lightning also might be attracted to a metal point. And here he proposes an So, can you attract lightning with a metal point? By the way, here's another of these experiments. Here's the Leyden jar. And one of the most destructive things that lightning does, of course, is strikes a house and can knock the house down, knock down the chimney, set the house on fire. Very damaging thing. And so if there is a way to demonstrate that you can attract lightning with a metal point, you actually could put a metal point on top of a house and have the electrical charge run through the wire and harmlessly into the ground. And here you can see what happens with Franklin's writing up of his experiments. Peter Collinson, when he receives them, has them printed by the Royal Society in 1751, these experiments and observations on electricity. And Franklin is writing up exactly what his little club had done, but also suggesting other ways to test different hypotheses. So, how would you test if lightning actually is electricity? And here in this, this is the frontispiece. You can see in the middle of the screen, I can actually find a better image of this, a man in a sentry box. And he has, sticking up from the sentry box, a wire. And the wire is going to, he's going to be on top of a church steeple. Okay, so this is the idea. You put this guy in a sentry box on top of the church steeple and have a pointed iron rod, some 20 or 30 feet high, aimed up in the sky. Then when clouds are passing over, lightning clouds are passing over, if they contain electricity, they will electrify the rod. So the question isn't so much, is lightning electricity, but do clouds contain electricity? And are the clouds similar to the glass jar that you can electrify by rubbing with a piece of wool? And is this electricity something that is in all of these things? And thus, this wire is going to demonstrate not that lightning is electricity, but that the electricity itself is contained in clouds. Electricity is contained in all things, even in the clouds. It's not just something you create as kind of a parlor trick. And he has this man in the sentry box holding a wire coil, and one hand is fastened to this lead, and the other one goes into a Leyden jar. And this is going to be, finding out if electricity exists in all things is a fundamental piece of scientific knowledge. Franklin said it's not of much importance to us to know the manner in which nature executes her laws. It's enough if we know the laws themselves. 'Tis of real use to know that China, left in the air unsupported, will fall and break. But how it comes to fall and why it breaks are matters of speculation. 'Tis a pleasure indeed to know them, but we can preserve our China without it. So this is what he's trying to get at here. Is lightning electricity? And is more than that, is electricity in all things? And can we find that out? What is it that holds the universe together? Remember, that's still the big question here, which this electrical fluid is going to help to demonstrate. Maybe this is what holds the world together. So as I said, Peter Collinson reads Franklin's protocols at the Royal Society of London. And then in 1751, Collinson has Franklin's observations on electricity published. Here is the experiments and observations on electricity made at Philadelphia in America by Benjamin Franklin, LLD, etc. And so this is actually the 5th edition and published in, looks like the 1770s. Here you can see a French edition that comes out a year after it's published in London. And 6 years later, a German edition published in Leipzig. That is, this is big news in Europe, these experiments on electricity by this group of guys in Philadelphia, which is why in Europe they refer to these as the Philadelphia experiments. Different people in Europe had played with this, with the electrical kiss and the Leyden jar and so on. The thing Franklin is doing is writing down a scientific protocol so that other people can do these experiments and figure out if they can replicate them, then that means the experiment's valid. If not, then they know the experiment didn't work. And the experiments now underlie all of the electrical work being done in Europe. In fact, in France, the whole idea of the clouds containing electricity falls into a set of rivalries in France, actually between France and England. One is a kind of a rivalry between Newtonians, that is, people who were adherents to the theories of Sir Isaac Newton. Newtonians saw gravity as a universal law, and electricity is a force running through everything. On the other side, the French tended to subscribe to the ideas of René Descartes. And Descartes saw vortices in all elementary matter. And this is what holds things up. And there's also a dispute, so big dispute between Newton and Descartes. Both Newton and Descartes are long dead at this time, but there are scientific adherents of Newtonianism and Descartesianism. And they tended to break down along political lines, that is England versus France. But there also is within France a dispute about the nature of electricity. The Abbé Jean-Antoine Nollet was a French priest who also experimented with electricity. And one of his big experiments was actually another pretty cool one. He had 200 monks. You know, Abbé Nollet is a priest, so he has access to big groups of French monks. And he has 200 monks form a circle a mile around. And he connects them with copper wire. And then he sends a charge through the copper wire, and 200 monks forming a mile-round circle jump simultaneously. Quite an extraordinary experiment. Now, Nollet believes that electricity is particularized. That is, it's part of these vortices holding things up. Franklin and the Newtonians are arguing that electricity is a constant fluid and it flows, so it's not particularized and so on. Now, another French natural scientist, natural philosopher, Georges Leclerc, who later is the Comte de Buffon, and Buffon is a famous French writer of the century. He reads Franklin's Philadelphia experiments, and he sees an opportunity to do something that is of great interest to any French man of science, which is to prove wrong another French man of science. And Buffon and another French philosopher, Jean-Francois Dalibard, show Franklin's experiments to the king. And this will be King Louis XV. And this, of course, annoys Nollet to no end because he is the official experimenter for the king. Now, in May of 1752, Dalibard instructs his assistant to carry out the Philadelphia experiments. Now, this is, Franklin had a real problem in carrying out this experiment. In order for the experiment to happen, he would need to put a sentry box on top of a church steeple. And his problem in Philadelphia was there weren't any church steeples. Back in Boston, when he had visited in 1743, he had seen a couple of really impressive church steeples. These are two Boston churches which still stand, both built in the 1720s, and really tall church steeples. There's not a tall church steeple in Philadelphia. There is, in fact, a work going on to build Christ Church in Philadelphia. Franklin is a generous subscriber to the Christ Church Building Fund. I don't know if the pastor understood why Franklin was so much interested in having a tall church steeple on Christ Church, tall enough so that he could put a sentry box up there and test out whether electricity is in the clouds, but it's not done in time. But meanwhile, back in France, Dalibard and Delors set up an apparatus that looks kind of like this. It's an iron framework that extends very far up into the sky. They couldn't find, I suppose, Nollet had closed the churches of France to this kind of experimentation, to these guys who are going to prove Newton and Franklin right. And at Marly, outside of Paris, in an open field, they build this apparatus. It's an iron frame. And Dalibard and Delors are watching this iron frame as the sky is filling with clouds. And what do you think happens? As clouds pass over, they see it's not lightning striking this, but the entire apparatus lighting up as electricity is coming from the clouds into it. And one French convert, the whole structure is lit up, and everyone watches this is absolutely astonished. And one French convert who was a Descartesian, and he had ridiculed Franklin for trying to empty clouds of their thunder, and thought that Franklin must have become an imaginary being that the English have made up. He becomes converted to this, and in June, there are reports from France being printed in English newspapers. And by August of 1752, the London Magazine has news of these successful experiments being conducted in France, as well as some successful experiments happening in Germany, where they had tried similar things out with similar results. Now, this is the December 1752 Gentleman's Magazine, and you can see down toward the bottom of the left column, Article 13, New Electrical Experiment by B. Franklin. Franklin got tired of waiting for a church steeple in Philadelphia. And so his problem really is, how do you demonstrate that clouds contain electricity if you don't have a church steeple handy? And the answer, of course, is to try to get something up into the air. And in this case, it's a kite. Now, I should say, this might be the most famous scientific experiment ever conducted in America, and one of the most important discoveries in human history. Actually, Joseph Priestley, the natural philosopher whom I talked about last time, said that this experiment was the greatest since the time of Sir Isaac Newton. But I have to tell you, we can't be entirely sure when it happened or even if it happened. We know that someone in France was trying it out. We know people in Germany were trying it out. We know people in England also are trying it out. The problem was the summer of 1752 was cold and rainy in England, and so not really a good time to experiment with trying to find out if there is electricity in the clouds because it was too damp. Now, Franklin does give instructions on how you would do this using a kite. And he later, I should say, Priestley writes down how it would be done. And Franklin, according to Priestley, was really stymied in Philadelphia by not having any steeples high enough. And so he can't build a sentry post on top of a church. But what he does is get a kite, which he makes out of silk. And the thinking was silk actually could carry an electrical charge, being very thin. And so a silk handkerchief, most kites are made of paper, but if it's going to rain, you don't want a paper kite. So silk is something that will hold its form if it gets a little wet. And at the top of the kite, you affix a sharp wire. And from that wire, the wire has to extend about a foot or more above the wood of the kite. And then you hang from the kite string a metal key. Now, when Franklin and his son, by the way, his son at this time is about in his 20s. Actually, he's about 30. In some of the representations you'll see of this, Franklin and his son, who seems like about 8 years old. So it's kind of a natural thing in some ways for dad and his 8-year-old son to go fly a kite. It's not a natural thing at all if you're flying a kite when it looks like there's going to be a thunderstorm. In fact, people who see two middle-aged men, one in his 40s, or this is 1752, one in his mid-40s and the other about 30, flying a kite when it looks like there's going to be a thunderstorm, people are going to think these guys are really crazy. I mean, you're not going to advertise this. Remember, Dalibard and Delors in France had all kinds of people coming to watch their apparatus light up. But imagine if this thing is a fiasco. That's one big problem. And then B, telling people we're going to go fly a kite because we see a thunderstorm approaching. You know, it's not going to be something you're going to want to write to people about and say, hey, come watch us fly a kite. So we don't know if it ever actually happened. We suspect it probably did sometime in May or June of 1752, which is when, according to Priestley, Franklin conducted this particular experiment. He and William go to a nearby field. William actually is the one who gets the kite up in the air. And if you ever have an opportunity to do something like this with a father figure in your life, and you'll know that you're probably going to be the one doing the work of getting the kite up there. And then when there's a shed nearby where they can take refuge when it starts to rain. So they get the kite up into the air. And Benjamin Franklin probably stayed in the shed. Of course, didn't want people to see him out here flying a kite when it looked like it was going to be raining. And it's up there, it's flying, the storm clouds are blowing over, and the first one blows over, and nothing happens. But boy, what a fiasco this is. He doesn't know at this time that the French guys have lit up their entire iron structure, proving that his theory is true. So first cloud passes over, no effect. Another cloud passes over, nothing's happening. And Benjamin Franklin is about to tell William, let's call it a day and get out of here before it starts raining. But then he notices that the hemp fibers on the kite string are all sticking straight out, as though they've all had the same force applied to them, or as if they're all suspended on a common conductor. And then he moves his knuckle toward the key hanging from the kite string, and he gets a shock in his knuckle from the key. And when the kite string was completely wet, Franklin holds up a Leyden jar to the key, and the Leyden jar collects the electrical fluid, fire, very copiously. So Franklin, with the kite and with his son, have demonstrated not that lightning is electricity, because there aren't any lightning clouds. There's no lightning yet, but with the kite, they have been collecting electricity from the clouds. And as I said, the summer was cold and rainy in London, impossible to perform similar experiments. But in Berlin, Germans were doing this, the French were doing this, and now in Philadelphia, we have Franklin doing this. Just imagine this. Paris, London, Berlin are the centers of the scientific world. And the leading scientific lights of the age are all conducting experiments based on this hypothesis offered by this printer in Philadelphia. Someone who didn't have any formal training in the field which they really led. And he does a similar experiment. The real news here, though, isn't that Franklin, with his kite, shows that the clouds contain electricity. The real news here is that Franklin, this guy in Philadelphia, had theorized that the clouds contain electricity, and then the scientific lights of the world set out either to prove him right or prove him wrong. And he never actually had to fly the kite because he had these guys in Europe who were doing the work based on the theories he had written down. Now, as I said, Franklin really hoped that all of this kind of toying around with the electrical fluid might lead to something practical. And that fall, Poor Richard's Almanac offered a method to secure ships and houses from being struck by lightning. This is a big thing. Now that we understand what lightning is, we've been doing this other work to control the electrical fluid. And if this is simply the electrical fluid, we now know how to control that. So you'll run a wire from the highest part of the building, an iron rod at the highest part of the building, and then you have a brass wire running from that rod down into the ground and run it 3 or 4 feet into the earth. And by the way, this is where the term grounded comes from in dealing with electricity. And similarly, with a ship, you can have a wire attached to a mast and lead that down into the water where it won't set the ship on fire, but instead will simply let the electrical charge pass harmlessly into the and actually, our friend Ebenezer Kinnersley goes on tour. Let me show you his apparatus for demonstrating this. This is a great sales tool for a lightning rod. And Kinnersley had a little model house like this built. And the little model house would be filled with gunpowder. And then as part of his demonstration, he would have the electrical fluid made in the jar over here, and then pass by a chain here, and then this is going to be the lightning rod. And as you can see, the house has a little switch you can turn, and you can either have the charge connected, in which case the electricity goes through the wire, through this, and then harmlessly into the ground, or Kinnersley would do the demonstration without the connection. And what happened in that case is the electrical charge would come through the wire into this wire and then ignite all of the gunpowder inside the little model house and make it explode. It's a good way of selling a lightning rod, because you wouldn't want your house to explode if you don't put a lightning rod on top of it. Franklin was always disappointed that this is the only practical application he can think of in his lifetime for electricity, but he's always sure there must be others. And other people were as well. The impact of Franklin's experiment can't be exaggerated. The first honorary degree that Harvard College presented was in 1752, or in 1753 in July. It presented an honorary master's degree to Benjamin Franklin. And in September, Yale presented Franklin with an honorary master's degree. And on the 30th of November of 1753, the Royal Society of London presented the Copley Medal, which was the highest scientific award in the English-speaking world, to Franklin. And Franklin was the first person who was not a fellow of the Royal Society to receive the Copley Medal. He was also the first person who did not live in one of the British Isles to receive the medal. 3 years later, he was elected a fellow of the Royal Society, and they were so pleased to have Franklin as a member, they didn't charge him the annual membership fees. And he also became a corresponding member of the Royal Society of the Arts. And he also, at the end of the decade, received an honorary doctorate from St. Andrews in Scotland, one of the leading institutions of higher learning in the world. And St. Andrews also made him an honorary burgess of the town. This is when he happened to be in Scotland. And so he's an honorary burgess of St. Andrews. By the way, the headmaster at St. Andrews was a political economist named Adam Smith. And at St. Andrews and then at Edinburgh, Franklin met Adam Smith, as well as David Hume, probably the leading Scottish philosopher of the century. And with a doctorate from St. Andrews in 1759, Benjamin Franklin became ever after Dr. Franklin, an honorary degree given him by this very important, though very small college in Scotland. And this really makes Franklin into someone, an international celebrity. Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, said that Franklin was the Prometheus of the modern age. And a German named Peter Henry Tesdorf wrote a poem in German celebrating Franklin as this godlike man. He had never met Franklin, but he is this godlike man who is chosen by God to execute the greatest action ever done on earth. Imagine that. Someone in the middle of the 1700s thought that this experiment with electricity was the greatest action ever done on earth. And an anonymous poet wrote that when Franklin was called off of this earth, which he had so enriched, he would be greeted by Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon, and Newton, and placed in an electrical seat in heaven. A little ominous to be placed in an electrical seat on earth or in heaven. So you can see the kind of a fusion we have here. And so the thing is, by the way, the Abbé Nollet, who had made the 200 monks jump simultaneously, wrote his own book on electricity in which he challenged Franklin's theories. And at the same time, an expanded edition of Franklin's book appeared in London. And Franklin didn't think it necessary to respond to Abbé Nollet. He said, if my theories are accurate, then they'll live. If not, then they should be challenged. Now, Franklin and this small group of electricians in Philadelphia take glass and bits of cork and wool and use these things to make profound arguments and claims about the nature of matter. They're really working out Newton's theories about the forces that unify the cosmos, the things that hold us together. And Franklin's achievement really was to show us how you can prove these things or disprove them. And he's really working out protocols for testing these scientific hypotheses. He takes this field of electricity, which had been kind of a parlor trick, a curiosity, something that's going to get idle spectators to watch as we shoot sparks out of a boy's eyes, or make 200 monks jump in unison, and turns it into a science from which we're still continuing to learn things. So I hadn't actually planned to spend the whole time talking about Franklin and electricity, so I apologize for that. And when we come back next time, we'll be talking more about science. We will be coming back virtually next time, again, thanks to the miracle of electricity and the miracle of the internet. So I will see you all next week.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks, Chester.
Sure.